This is Rabbi Jeffrey Sacks, editor of Tradition, with another episode of our podcast. Following his passing last November, Tradition Online inaugurated the Rabbi Jonathan Sacks Bookshelves Project in tribute to Rabbi Sacks's impact on the spiritual and intellectual life of our community, examining aspects of his thought and teaching. Reading Rabbi Sacks's many books and listening to his lectures, one is not just impressed by his original insights and striking formulations, but also awed by his ability to integrate so many disparate sources. To read his work is to experience a well-guided tour of Matthew Arnold's ideal of the best that has been thought and said. Throughout his writing, Rabbi Sacks quotes broadly from Torah sources, yet also reaches deeply into classical and contemporary writers on philosophy, politics, society, popular research in psychology, ethics, economics, sociology, history, across wide ranges of disciplines. While Rabbi Sacks's loss has been felt worldwide, there can be no doubt that Anglo Jewry has suffered this tragedy most sharply. We have been comforted in the opportunity to share the teaching and writing of so many distinguished British scholars, thinkers, rabbis, and educators as we assess the legacy of Rabbi Sacks, Zichrono Livracha. In this episode, our associate editor, Chaim Strauchler, spoke with three of the series' many authors. They discuss why Rabbi Sacks read and quoted the books that he did and the role those books played in Rabbi Sacks's leadership and philosophy. They look at some common themes emerging from the Bookshelves Project and the optimistic view of humanity with which Rabbi Sacks leaves us, his readers and students. Our guests for the episode are Rabbi Johnny Solomon, a teacher at Madreshet Lindenbaum in Matan, an editor at Mosaica Press, and an educational consultant. Dr. Lindsay Taylor Gotthardts, a research fellow at the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Manchester and at the London School of Jewish Studies, and Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum, the Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies. This is my opportunity to thank my colleague, Chaim Strauchler, for his passion and energy and creativity in spearheading this initiative for TraditionOnline.org. We're also grateful to the many authors who participated in the series, and to our partners at the London School of Jewish Studies and at the Rabbi Sacks Legacy Trust. Here's the conversation.
So Lindsay, if you could please frame our conversation about Rabbi Sacks by reading from John Donne's Meditations and specifically the role of books and the idea to which books are become a metaphor for life more generally.
Yes, well, it's really appropriate for Rabbi Sacks. So the quotation starts, "All mankind is of one author and is one volume. When one man dies, one chapter is not torn out of the book, but translated into a better language. And every chapter must be so translated. God employs several translators. Some pieces are translated by age, some by sickness, some by war, some by justice. But God's hand is in every translation, and his hand shall bind up all our scattered leaves again for that library where every book shall lie open to one another."
Now Rabbi Sacks took that idea, I'm not sure if he got it from Donne, but this idea of comparing a person to a book in his own writing. And Johnny mentioned this to us, that in his book, Radical Then, Radical Now, Rabbi Sacks develops this metaphor to make a specific point about Jewish life. So Johnny, if you could pick us up from there.
With pleasure, and thank you. Imagine that we are in a vast library. In every direction we look, there are bookcases. Each has shelves stretching from the floor to the ceiling, and every shelf is full of books. We are surrounded by the recorded thoughts of many people, some great, some less so, and we can reach out and take any book we wish. All we have to do is choose. We begin to read, and for a while we're immersed in the world, real or imaginary, of the writer. It may intrigue us enough to lead us to look for other books by the same writer, or perhaps others on the same subject. Alternatively, we can break off and try a different subject, a different approach. There is no limit. Once a book no longer interests us, we can put it back on the shelf, where it will wait for the next reader to pick up. It makes no claim on us. It's just a book. That, for the contemporary secular culture of the West, is what identity is like. We are browsers in the library. There are many different ways of living, and none exercises any particular claim on us. None of them more than any other defines who we are, and we can try any for as long as we like. The various lifestyles into which we enter are like books we read. We're always free to change them, to put them back on the shelf. They are what we read, not what we are. Judaism asks us to envisage an altogether different possibility. Imagine that while browsing in the library, you come across one book, unlike the rest, which catches your eye because on its spine is written the name of your family. Intrigued, you open it and see many pages written by different hands in many languages. You start reading it and gradually begin to understand what it is. It is a story each generation of your ancestors has told for the sake of the next, so that everyone born into this family can learn where they came from, what happened to them, what they live for, and why. As you turn the pages, you reach the last, which carries no entry but a heading. It bears your name. Other books may make no special claim on me. They may be interesting, inspiring, entrancing, but this one is different. Its very existence poses a set of questions addressed not to the universe, but to me. Will I write my own chapter? Will it be a continuation of the story of those who came before? Will I, when the time comes, hand the book on to my children? Or will I by then have forgotten it or given it away to a museum as an heirloom for the past? This is more than an imaginative exercise. There is such a book, and to be a Jew is to be a life, a chapter in it. This book contains the knowledge of who I am. It is perhaps the most important thing I can be given.
Beautiful. So, of course, the title for this book in its American publication is based upon this metaphor, which is a letter in a scroll. And this is a beautiful evocation about what books can be and what Jewish life can be as well. And it was not with this intent necessarily that we began this project of the Rabbi Sacks Bookshelves Project. But we tried through a series of essays about Rabbi Sacks's works in which he quoted other authors to profile those authors and to speak a little bit about how Rabbi Sacks made use of those books. And while those books often were from the earlier part of the library in that quote that Johnny just read, I would argue that Rabbi Sacks did not just put them back on the shelf and let them disappear, but that those bookshelves became a piece of who he was in some way. Mm-hmm. And that in celebrating Rabbi Sacks's life, to reflect upon those books is to gain a little bit of insight into who Rabbi Sacks was. Rafi, would you like to speak a little bit about the process by which Rabbi Sacks picked up those books and how he formed that library and those bookshelves that we are celebrating?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chaim. I mean, so it's interesting, you know, for many people as rabbis, their basic fundamental knowledge is their Torah learning. And then maybe later on, they get a bit of wider learning. They might do a master's or a PhD and gain a different subject. For Rabbi Sacks, we know it was reversed for him, right? He went to university and became more religious afterwards and became a rabbi after he'd done his PhD. So it's a slightly different order about him. And that always makes me think about how involved he was in terms of general secular books and so on. But I think the key issue of why he got so involved in a whole world of culture is something that happened to him historically. So, you know, he'd been the principal of Jews College for many years, and he was invited in 1990 in London to give what's called the Wreath Lectures. Lindsay, correct me if I say this incorrectly, but which is they're public lectures on a contemporary issue in society. Which is then on the BBC and is listened to by all different kinds of people culturally. So it was a great honor for him to do it. And he worked really hard on talking about the idea of religion within a secular age. And he had a great reaction to that book that came out. And to do that, he had to learn how to relate his Jewish ideas and thinking about the importance of religion in the modern world. And not just talking to a Jewish audience, but to a general audience. And that led to a very wide reading that he did. And he had a wonderful reaction to that. And that made him think that actually, when he became chief rabbi, that part of his role is to speak to general society for two reasons. One, for the Jews that are out there, who are not going to listen through synagogues, but will respect a rabbi speaking on the radio rather than in the synagogue. And second of all, for the Jews' place within British society, that they should be a respected group, denomination group within that society. So, and what was going on in England, there was lots of challenges of the way society was changing. And he really felt that it was a language already called the third sector, as well as the first sector of the markets and the economy and society, and the second of the state and the government. The third sector of community and family was kind of falling apart. And he wrote a book called The Politics of Hope, which was a reaction to that. And in the original book, which I've got, I remember going to the book launch. He said, I remember him saying exactly, he said, I had to disrobe as a chief rabbi to write this. And it was interesting by that language. What does it mean, disrobe? Since then, instead of taking off the Gemara, taking off the Jewish thinking and reading the general wider work in order to be able to relate, which is what he did. And then I looked just now, it came out in I think 97. It was a wonderful reaction, but 3 years later they published a paperback version of it with introduction by Gordon Brown, who became the Prime Minister. And I want to read you just one paragraph of what Sacks wrote at the beginning of the preface, because it really shows you what he was trying to achieve with his books. And it says the following. He says, in the 3 years since The Politics of Hope was first published, I've been encouraged by the response it has evoked. Parts of it were serialized in the Times. It's been cited by senior figures in the government and the opposition. Because of it, I've been visited by, among others, labor organizers from the United States, mine workers from South Africa, and community groups throughout Britain. I've been asked to lecture to think tanks in Washington, economists and wealth activists in London, and senior army officers at Sandhurst. The themes I raised: marriage, the family, community, citizenship, education, civil society, responsibility alongside rights, and the social covenant, as well as the social contract, have been part of the mainstream of public debate. The book touched the chord, as I hoped it would. This book, that is him realizing this works. I can do this. And from then on, he always was publishing books for the Jewish community, but also for general society. He found a way that a rabbi could speak to a wider society. And as a result, he had to read and keep up with the trends and cultural ideas that were going on in the world, which is what he did. And because he'd always been an academic and was a voracious reader, it came naturally to him. But I really think that's the reason why he became this kind of unique position that he occupied.
So you're arguing that he chose the books to meet the needs of the job, as opposed to being a person who just loved those books because he was interested in it inherently.
Well, I think he was a general reader, but then when he saw society was going in a new area, he would swallow all those issues. I remember on the book on responding to multiculturalism, the home we built together, he said, my approach, Rafi, is, he said, I find the topic, I find every book that I can on it, read them all, and then try and work out what they're saying, classify them, and then what he thinks about them. I mean, I remember when he was doing the Machzorim later on, and he was in the introductions to Machzorim, so for instance, he'd have to write about Megillah Esther, Shir Hashurim. So we'd get a cab arriving at London School of Jewish Studies, which was Jewish College, and it basically said, can you put the 2 shelves of those, of Megillah Esther, or all the commentaries on Esther in, and send them? And we'd put in boxes in the cab, and then 2 months later, all read, they'd come back. So that was his approach. Read what everybody else has said first, collate it, understand it, and then work out its relevance to what you want to say about it. So I think he was a general reader, but once he was interested in the subject, he then explored that more and more and more. And that's why he moved much more from, into moral philosophy and social responsibility issues.
Obviously, that role within society only flowered with the years as Rabbi Sacks wrote more books and took on more challenges within the society as a whole. Ben Crown, writing for this project, compared Rabbi Sacks to Chesterton. And perhaps, Lindsay, you can touch a little bit upon what that role was in general society.
Well, very much like Chesterton, and a lot of Rabbi Sacks's ideas, I think, are not even associated with him particularly anymore. Simply, he introduced them into general discourse, as you were saying a bit earlier. And because he did that, he performed this role of what you might call a cultural ferryman. He went in both directions, which is fascinating because not so many people do that. The thing that perhaps reminds me most of this incredibly important cultural function actually is the 13th century in Spain, when Jews are translating works of Arabic into Hebrew and into Latin, and they're ferrying them to the rest of Western Europe from the Muslim areas of Spain. And Jews in many places, many times, have acted as those cultural translators. So I think we can put Rabbi Sacks in that very, very ancient and very, very honorable tradition of somebody who moves between two worlds and brings in the ideas of wider society to what can be a parochial Jewish community, and in the other direction brings items from the entire range of classical Jewish thought, not just bits of the Bible, but the whole of rabbinic literature, the whole of later Jewish philosophy and so on, into the wider world to people who would have no inkling that such things existed at all. So that double-faced back and forth, and the ability to reach such a huge audience in both cases, again, that is rather like Chesterton, who himself was, as Ben mentioned, was a member of a minority. He was a Catholic, and again was doing this double facing, this two journey ferrying across of ideas and thought. So from that point of view, I think Rabbi Sacks has had an enormous impact, probably largely that can't be traced, because how are we ever going to know how many people latched onto something they would never have thought of that comes from Jewish tradition, or conversely, how many people will know exactly how much he helped to deparochialize the Jewish community here. And he certainly, Rafi reminded me of this the other day, that at his lectures, I used to go to his lectures quite often, he would give a whole bibliography as he went along. And you say, you should read this and this and this. And occasionally when I got excited, I would write them down. Occasionally I went off and read them. And they included some pretty remarkable things, like Michael Fishbane's biblical interpretation of ancient Israel, which you wouldn't have thought was perhaps the choice of a British chief rabbi. But he would just, list these books. And if you did go off and pursue them, they brought you into worlds that you certainly wouldn't have found on your own. So again, how do you quantify that sort of effect? I think he, in many, many ways, he had a very profound effect at that somewhat intangible level, but no less important level of, yes, the cultural ferryman par excellence, perhaps.
Now, I've got a great example of that, Lindsay, on the other end from a Fishbane book, which was a book. Do you have pret-a-manger in the States, Chaim? Those series of shops?
I don't think so.
Oh, it's kind of a general all-purpose, like coffee, and so it's not kosher. General stores.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
Yes. So someone gave me this booklet, which I have, which is a little booklet that was available at Pret. It came out in 2007, and it was like little quotes and good stuff. Some recipes. It's got Chinese. I don't think Johnny's even seen this. Chinese proverbs. It's got a quote from Martina Navratilova on the back, which says, "It's like ham and eggs. The chicken is involved. The pig is committed." Right? Inside the book, Chinese proverbs, recipes, and a quote by Rabbi Sacks, which says, "The idols of today are unmistakable. Self-esteem without effort, fame without achievement, sex without consequences, wealth without responsibility, pleasure without struggle, and experience without commitment." So his writing, just as Lindsay said, was so generalized that a booklet of a kind of treif, like general store restaurant talking modern aphorisms would have Chinese proverbs, a female tennis player, and the chief rabbi of the UK. So that's
you can't get better than that.
Exactly.
I think that
So I
underscores
kept it because it's so unusual.
that Rabbi Sacks's flexibility and also his seeking out these things. So whether it be the BBC or his website and his weekly Dvar Torahs that were sent to Jews around the world, and perhaps to others as well, that Rabbi Sacks was seeking to be a ferryman of a specific type. And he takes what the Jews were doing in the 13th century in Spain and really modernizes it to a great extent, where it's not just about the books on the bookshelf, but it's about the internet. It's about modern media, social media, finding all these ways to communicate his wisdom, his Torah, in ways that past rabbis could never have imagined. Johnny, can you talk a little bit about Rabbi Sacks's balancing the media for the person? A lot of what we're speaking about is the metaphor of a book to a person, whether that be in Rabbi Sacks's book, Radical Then, Radical Now, or in John Dunn's work, or even in our project as well. But to what degree was Rabbi Sacks about the book, and to what degree was he about the person?
Well, Undoubtedly, Rabbi Sacks, and he says this himself, felt he encountered God in an extraordinary way when he met people. And in a number of the books that have been reviewed in the best series, not only did he read and quote these books, but he knew the authors and he had strong relationships with them. Rabbi Sacks believed that whenever we have the possibility of sharing ideas and influencing the world for the better, we need to harness this. In fact, in To Heal a Fractured World, he quotes one of his great role models, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who, based on a reading of the Rambam, who says that when you have the ability to move the world towards morality, one should do so, and this was Moshe's responsibility. So too, Rabbi Sacks believed that the internet, but so too the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and then Rabbi Sacks believed that media and the internet was a medium which could bring influence to the world. He often distinguished between power and influence. He was very critical of power, but he was very positive of influence. And he felt that that was a realm where religion should situate itself. And as the media became more and more powerful in the modern age, he believed that the voice of religion, the voice of faith, needs to step up to the plate. He once said, I used to work for Jewish Interactive, and he made a video for them. And in that short clip, he said, whenever a new medium is created, whenever a new platform, I feel that God is beckoning us, knocking on our doors to say, use this, lahagdil Torah lahadira. And so Rabbi Sacks believed in the power of sharing ideas in books and on the internet and through videos, etc. But he believed most powerfully in connecting with people. And though a lot of people know Rabbi Sacks through their books, when we saw him meeting children in schools, you know, one of them, many times I got to see him was when he used to visit the schools where I worked. He really, really was so lifted by the energy of young people. A great video that people probably haven't watched, they should. You know, you'll watch the videos of him giving lectures, but it's when he's singing Oseh Shalom with young children in Jewish primary schools in the UK, and he was really on cloud nine. So he was a man of books and he was a man of immense wisdom, but he was a person who valued so much the individual. And that's why there's such a deep aching on his passing, because we didn't just lose the wisdom to continue to respond to the modern age, although we've got this great library of wisdom which we need to plumb further. But there was a person who gave so many people chizuk, and he was a really radiating spark that lifted so many of us.
So we've spoken a little bit about the bookshelf and what it means to be that translator, what it means to be that person who bridges between the book and the person. But why don't we speak a little bit about the content of the bookshelf? What was it that was in Rabbi Sacks's scroll? If we were to take a step back and think about where all these books stay together, what is the message, if it's possible for us to do so, to take from the books that Rabbi Sacks put on his shelf, and where does that leave us as students and also as our creators of our own bookshelves? What is it that we have to learn?
And there's a number of issues. I'd say a couple, which is so he, instead of just opinions about how to live today, he wanted it to be based on research, whether scientific or historical. So if there were trends in the way people were reacting in society, how families are working, he looked at the latest statistics to see what are the neuroscientists or the researchers saying today, so that it wasn't just, you know, a rabbi giving a sermon, giving an opinion of what he thinks society should be. He's like, well, what have we learned about society? So he took that very seriously. And another issue which he really loved was uncovering the story, not just of Jewish tradition, but of Jews in history and the contributions they made to society and what people had written about Jews. And he was interested in that, you know, Daniel Deronda, all these, just culturally, what that meant. Because first of all, it taught, because we often think, you know, that there's a history of Jewish books, but there's a history of Jewish people and what that contribution was. And he knew that was also an important thing to learn. So I think looking back historically of the role of Jews in world history. And as I said, secondly, being cutting edge with what are the political trends, psychological trends, scientific trends that are in the world today, so that Judaism isn't behind them, is aware of them and can respond and react. I think those for me was key. So basically, as a result of by Sacks and just directly, if a new book comes out on a issue of social science by one of these public important, New York Times bestsellers by a scholarly academic, so he read popular books, but often by scholarly academics, then he'd want to read it. And now I want to read them to keep up. So he kind of put it into me and so many of us to keep up with what's going on, so that our Judaism is chadash, is hayom, is as if it was given today.
Absolutely. Johnny, I think you made that point about Robert Putnam and his celebrating this new work that backed up his position, which existed years before.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, Rabbi Sacks himself, already in the Reith Lectures in 1990, was exploring the relationship between faith, family, and community. This was a core to his thesis then. And then Bowling Alone, or the original essay, as pointed out in 1995, the book in 2000, was published. And this gave him language and data to help enrich and expand a thesis which was already evident to him. And I just wanted to go back to what Rafi mentioned about the Reith Lectures. His lectures in 1990 were themselves a response to the 1967 Reith Lectures of Edmund Leach. So he was aware of what's going on in the world and often very concerned by certain trends, and often trying to figure out the right pathway, both in terms of ideas and language, to respond that meets the needs of the hour and speaks to the hearts of the people. And this is what Rabbi Sacks did, not just once or twice, but time after time after time. And he would fuse the wisdom, the research, the language of people like Robert Putnam with the phrases that he himself coined. And his books are a magisterial tapestry of taking the chokhmah that he's learnt elsewhere and bringing his Torah v'chokhmah that he had attained. And what came out was something magnificent, something where you couldn't quite see where his Torah interpretations were ending and the great readings of these shells that we're exploring began. And that fusing of Torah v'chokhmah in his personality, in every page of the works that he wrote and every line of the speeches that he gave, made it so stimulating. Because even when he started explaining a pasuk, and most times when the rabbi starts saying, the verse says, with Rabbi Sacks, you never knew how the sentence would end, because he'd then quote a poet, right? Daniel Rose wrote a beautiful piece about Leonard Cohen. He'd quote musicians, and it was always so refreshing, so exciting, so unexpected, so relevant. And that's what made him so electric as a personality, as a scholar.
Lindsay, you summarized that idea in your piece, where you spoke about John Donne and Rabbi Sacks both creating a life of connection in the presence of God. And I thought that was really a beautiful summary in some respects of this project, but also of so much of Rabbi Sacks's work, this idea of connection. He gets very much into that in his book Morality, in terms of creating the we in place of the I. And to be able to do so within the society as we have it in the presence of God is something of such great meaning and great, I think you said it very well.
One thing that occurs to me that in forging those connections was that he was not at all frightened of reaching into what might have been perceived as hostile territory or difficult territory or challenging territory from an Orthodox perspective. I don't think that Rabbi Sacks thought there was anything he should not read. And I think he felt, and it's something I find very attractive, that if you have a strong faith, if you know who you are, nothing is going to deflect you from that. It may enrich you, you may discard it, but it's not going to be a source of danger. And I think that's a really, really useful corrective, because there are, as we know, there are trends in certain parts of the Orthodox world that say, don't go beyond this boundary, don't read that, don't listen to those people, don't find out about anything from, Christian theology to what have you, because it will threaten you and it will harm you and it will destabilize your faith. And I think he was blessedly free of that. He was not at all frightened to voyage to completely new perspectives and take what was useful and be totally unthreatened by what was not useful. And that, I think, is very inspirational, that to be a we, then you need to explore the other. You can't sit in your own little tight community going, well, I'm happy to be we, but I don't actually want to know anything about you.
He did that also with the books that he would quote, that it wasn't just he read them, but he would also share them. So he'll quote Freud or quote Ayer, and he'll lay out their arguments, and then he'll go head to head. It wasn't that he wanted to learn from them. He was prepared to take on anyone, and that was one of our great heroes in that way. That's a fighter.
Yes.
So I want to speak a little bit about Rabbi Sacks's development as a person through his bookshelf. And I think that Rafi noted that he, in some respects, built his bookshelf around a certain trajectory about who he wanted to become, who he wanted to be, or more what was needed. And as much as Rabbi Sacks would often criticize the self-help movement and the selfie and so on and so forth, he was really a self-creation in so many ways, and that no rabbi in the history of our people has ever done what Rabbi Sacks has done. And he was writing his own script as he went along. And I think that there's something certainly to be celebrated in that. But there's also something there's almost something of a story in that too, that he really was writing his own scroll as that image that he created in that book, Radical Then, Radical Now, that he wrote a whole chapter of that book that was not there before. And that's something which is tremendous.
He really believed in encouraging others to do that. That's what I find interesting. You'll find quotes from him on the back of many books of many different, rabbis and teachers who've published books. And some of them weren't always as good as others, but he wanted to always encourage people to write. And when he would sign books, he would say positive things and encourage people to do things, because he realized that motivation is so hard just to get around to doing something. It might not be the best one, but it's not bad. So encourage it and encourage more to happen. He was the opposite of someone trying to control. He was really trying to empower others. But I think, Chaim, as you say, that comes from a big belief in creating yourself. Therefore, encourage others to create as well. You have commitments to your community and to society, but you must grow. And that encouragement was always fundamental. We all felt it.
Absolutely. There was also a certain optimism to his ideology and his writing and his speaking. And despite all of the critical piece of being the Chesterton of our day, as it were, that there's so much to criticize, but he would always seem to criticize in a way that there was hope at the end. At the end of every chapter, there's something that we can do to make it better. And I wonder, in this age, in this moment, whether it be of our politics or of our society, is that something that can be continued?
I know he didn't do it naively, right? Which is important, because I think some religious leaders give quaint, positive answers the whole time. He admitted difficulty and complexity. There was one priest who said after he passed away that he never fobbed us off with cheap certainties. That was a great quote. I really like that. But at the end, he would always be positive where he would stop. Like in the laning, there's difficult parts of the Torah, but you can't end on a low. You have to end on a positive. So he did in that sense. So being upbeat doesn't mean not recognizing darkness and horror and even sadness. I think he was really related to those, but then you move it forward. So it's the combination of the two that's key. If you just simplistically ride the positive, it's not real. So for me, it was I'm quite negative in some ways in the way I think about things. So he brought me up, but I would listen to him because I knew he understood that pain, that sadness, or that anger, but never, he would embrace it, but never succumb to it. And I think that's fundamental.
I think you see that very much in his last book, Immorality, where about 2/3 is going through the problems of the modern age, everything from the internet to drugs, you name it. But the last third is where he turns around the whole thing. And again, this idea of serving as a model or addressing what is possible. he definitely does say, look, I'm not asking for spectacular mass movements. He's saying this lies, the problem of changing from an I society to a we society starts with everyone. At whatever level, we're all quite capable of doing this. And that is what will transform society. It doesn't get transformed from the outside, it gets transformed by the individuals who make it up and link to each other. So it was an eminently doable possibility that he presents at the end of the book, something that literally anyone reading that book could say, well, I could do something about that. So yes, very much what Rabbi was saying, that idea, okay, here is a manageable, optimistic program that's eminently practical that you can do, and you don't need to be anyone special to do it. But having read the first part of the book, you can now see why it's so necessary. So yes, it was definitely possibly a last clarion call to everyone. Yeah.
He really did face difficult times himself, I think, and that's also important to recognize. He called it being schmeist. You know, any religious leader, especially a rabbi, who's in the public eye, is going to get attacked by different groups. He always called it being schmeist. And there's a wonderful story. It was a Shabbaton we had for young people. Well, I say young people, Jewish students in, I think it was in St. John's Wood, and it was Parshat Tetzaveh. You'll see why that's relevant. And he'd just been attacked in the papers for some issue, whatever it was. And we all turned up for Shabbat, and we knew, like, you know, don't mention it because it wouldn't be appropriate and so on. So it comes to Shabbat morning. He's like 20 of us giving the Devar Torah, and he says, this week is Parshat Tetzaveh, which is the only Sedra from Shemot onwards in which Moshe Rabbeinu is not mentioned. And then he paused, and he looked and he said, you know, sometimes it's quite nice not to be in the papers. And I just, first of all, it's very funny, but also it's a recognition of a leadership that I could never imagine. But what must it have been like for Moshe Rabbeinu always to be challenged and for not to be? So that linking only experienced at that level. And that's why, you know, why do you love Ron Heifetz's leadership on the line? Because here was a theory of leadership that was based on difficulties and trouble, which he could then relate to. So then he got very into leadership as a result through that path. But, you know, because until then, a lot of the leadership books are very upbeat and positive. And he's like, no, that's not leadership. Leadership's getting schmeiced the whole time by your community. So that story really, really spoke to me.
Transformative leadership. Absolutely.
I'll just briefly mention, and Daniel Rose mentions this, and you see it in the clip of Rabbi Sacks when he hears of the death of Leonard Cohen, of whom he was a big fan. He gives a beautiful modern midrash on the words of Hallelujah. And he says, quoting Leonard Cohen in the song, even though it all went wrong, I'll stand before the Lord of Song with nothing on my tongue but Hallelujah. To which Rabbi Sacks then says, that is what it is to be a Jew, a person of faith. Even in the midst of darkness, there is light. Even in the midst of death, there is life. Even in the midst of hate, there is love. And even with our dying breath, we can still say Hallelujah. That is a power of love to redeem the brokenness of the world. And as he quoted there in a different song, Who by Fire, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So even on the hardest days, you know, he was a man of hope. Hope was one of the key words of Rabbi Sacks. And he lived it, and he modeled it. And even when the going was tough, and he was criticized and he, from various different directions about things he may have said, although he often, at least subtly, between his inner circle, was quite clear that he strongly believed in what he'd written and what he'd said. Nevertheless, even on those tough days, he maintained hope. And that was really a great thing to see.
So I think we're at time now. So I want to thank everyone for contributing. This is a great conversation. And with that, I'd like to close with one of Rabbi Sacks's first words every time he spoke, which was friends. And I think that we can certainly all feel as friends by being able to share in this Yerusha, this inheritance that we all have, in being able to tell stories and to be able to read books and to be able to appreciate the legacy of a great author, a great reader, a great speaker, and a great letter, a great series of letters, a great chapter in the scroll of our people. And so may each of us build our own bookshelves and write our own scrolls and continue to smile with hope along the way. Yashar kochachem. Thank you, everyone.